like to welcome all of you and thank all of you for coming. My name is Steve McInerney. I'm the Executive Director here at POMED, Project on Middle East Democracy. We're excited today to continue another event examining Bahrain. We've had several of these over the past 15 months or so. Bahrain is one of the countries in the region that's been shaken by the Arab Spring, but it's not resulted in a transition, and its future is still very much uncertain. And we think that it's a very important country in the region to look at, and both in terms of developments in Bahrain for what it means for Bahraini citizens and the rights of Bahrainis, also in terms of the broader region. Bahrain is the only one of the 6 states of the GCC that have been really fundamentally shaken by the protests that have swept much of the rest of the region. We also think that Bahrain is important in terms of sort of regional dynamics and the role of other states, particularly Saudi Arabia, and we think Bahrain is also an important sort of test case for U.S. policy. It's quite a challenging case for the U.S. to be able to play a constructive role and try to support the democratic aspirations of Bahrain citizens, as the administration has, pronounced that it's seeking to do. But at the same time, there are many strategic interests that make it a very difficult case. Our last public event on Bahrain was a discussion that we had on Capitol Hill in the middle of February. At that time, there was lots of, I think ours was probably one of about 6 or 8 public events in D.C. on Bahrain at that time, sort of in conjunction with the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of this protest movement on the 14th of February. Since that time, there's been less discussion. There haven't been many of these kind of events since that time, but there have been some developments in Bahrain, and I think there's a lot of the concerns that existed at that time that have sort of been growing over the last many months or more than a year now have only become exacerbated since we last had a discussion, and we thought it was important to kind of revisit and examine where things are now, where things are going, what risks there are, what main concerns there are. Since our last event, just in the last few weeks now, the holding of the Formula One race in Bahrain was a controversial event that, among other things, brought a lot of additional international attention to Bahrain. Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, a human rights activist who's been in prison for a year now, had just begun his hunger strike at the time that just a few days before our last event, and he's still now on hunger strike, and his condition, as you would expect after 3 months of hunger strike, has worsened considerably, and there's been lots of additional international attention and concern regarding his case. Just today, in the last couple of weeks, the Shura Council has ratified some constitutional amendments in Bahrain that the king is signing today, I believe, which I think for many sort of highlight the lack of real progress and reform. I think if someone had said in November, just at the time that the BICI Commission issued its report, that there were going to be amendments to the Constitution, by the beginning of May, I think many people would have seen that in a hopeful way, that it would have been sort of more meaningful than anything that we've seen, actually contained in the amendments. And then we also have next week the Crown Prince of Bahrain will be coming here to Washington, which will be the first such visit in quite some time. And I think so. I think this is an important moment as well to kind of look at the U.S. role, look at U.S. engagement with Bahrain, and how the international community and the U.S. In particular can play a positive role and try to help bring out some kind of resolution that empowers the citizens of Bahrain. We have a great panel of speakers here today to kind of help us look at all of these questions. Our first speaker will be Joost Hilterman. All 3 of our speakers have been in Bahrain within the past month, so they'll all be able to kind of give you sort of their impressions and takeaways, and kind of their analysis and thoughts today will be sort of informed by their recent time there. Joost Hilterman is the Deputy Program Director for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Crisis Group. And as I said, he was just in Bahrain a few weeks ago. Our second speaker will be Khalil Marzouk from Al-Wafaq, the main opposition party in Bahrain. He's currently the Assistant Secretary General of the Party for International and Political Affairs. He formerly was a member of the Bahraini Parliament and served as the first Deputy Speaker of the Bahraini Parliament until he resigned, along with all of his other Wafat colleagues, last spring in protest against the government's use of violence against protesters. And Tom Malinowski will be our third speaker. Tom is the Washington Director for Human Rights Watch. He also was recently in Bahrain. He was making a point just before we get started here that he's, of our three panelists, he's the only one that has been arrested by the Bahraini authorities. And he, as I understand it, he endured quite difficult conditions, and I think he said that he had to endure solitary confinement for approximately 1 minute while his colleague went down the hall for something. But his recent arrest in Bahrain also sort of heightened the international attention on some of the human rights cases there, and he'll be talking about some of the human rights concerns of the Bahraini government, as well as offering some suggestions and thoughts on U.S. policy as well.
I mean, I'm really the only person on this panel who has the credibility to speak about this subject.
So we'll have to wait till the other two have spoken to get back to Tom. But with that, I will turn it over to Joost.
Thank you very much, Steve, and I guess Tom, for this introduction as to my credibility. I was in Bahrain in late March, so not as recently as my two colleagues here, and I did not see the insides of a detention center. But I had some very useful impressions from that trip, and a real sense of polarization and of clashing narratives. We met with the government, of course. We met with representatives of parties that are with the government. We met with colleagues in opposition groups, such as Khalil Marzouk. And we met with non-political people in order to get as broad a view as possible. Of course, we were only allowed to be there for 5 days by the Bahraini authorities, so it was a limited time, especially for us, because we really prefer to do in-depth research, but we hope to be able to go back and continue our work. The striking thing was that when you were listening to the government, then you came away with this impression that after the Basuni report, the government had taken very swift and very incisive steps to implement the recommendations of this report. And the recommendations are, far-reaching, and there are a lot of them. And so, and there was a bureaucracy set up to implement these recommendations. And once government officials started listing these, you could see that from their perspective, they were doing actually a lot, especially given that it's a bureaucracy. They were really under clear orders to start working on these things. And if you looked at some of these, the implementation, sort of passing legislation or drafting legislation and then submitting it to Parliament for turning it into actual law, and measures taken, installing cameras in police stations, police cars, these kinds of things, then you would say, well, hey, not bad. These things are necessary. But if you look at the overall picture, you came away with this notion that maybe something was being done, and for a bureaucracy, this was all pretty hard work. On the other hand, it didn't even come close to what needed to be done according to these recommendations themselves. And the three main areas that were overlooked, at least so far, and I expect for some time: one, the release of political prisoners. Until this day, political prisoners remain in detention under their sentences from state security courts. Now, there has been a retrial ordered, and so maybe there will be a change, but for now, there has been no change in their status. And one of the prisoners, Abdel Hadi al-Khawaja, is today on his 85th day of a hunger strike, so in a very serious condition, and time is being frittered away. The second issue is the lack of accountability for senior security officials who must have given the orders for elements of the crackdown that were most egregious last year and ongoing, including orders for harsh interrogation and use of excessive force in the streets. No senior officials have been in any way sanctioned. One official has been removed from his post, but essentially been promoted. And thirdly, there has been no serious attempt at restructuring the security forces by integrating marginalized population, the Shiites in particular, who are of course the majority in Bahrain, into these security forces. A half-hearted attempt is being made by bringing initially 500 new recruits, Shia recruits, into the security forces, but this is clearly going to be a long process. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to do it. Obviously, there are serious challenges, but right now it doesn't seem that the regime has its heart in it, and I can assure you it doesn't. So that is one narrative, the government saying it is making real progress. On the other hand, the situation seems to be deteriorating. There is massive use of tear gas, as Tom Malinowski will tell you in a minute. Also on the opposition side, we now see, we have of course the political opposition, the legal opposition. No one is suggesting they are using violence, but these demonstrations that are taking place, there are now elements present that are resorting to the use of Molotov cocktails in increasing numbers. So that is a disturbing new trend, and we need to keep a close watch on that. There is, however, and I should add to that what is also sort of putting this whole situation in sort of in a different light is that you know, there has been, and I think Steve already said it, a total lack of progress on dialogue and political reform. There was an attempt at dialogue in early February, instigated by the Royal Palace actually. But it was quickly undermined when the news of it was leaked by an advisor to the king, and it came to naught. And I think Khalil al-Marzouk can tell you more about that particular attempt. The other very disturbing thing, speaking of polarization, was that there has been a real attempt at changing the narrative about what has taken place. The narrative, if you look back a year ago, was one of the Arab Spring chapter, the Bahraini chapter of the Arab Spring, where you had mass protests involving a cross-section of the population, acting against the regime that was accused of being very oppressive and non-participatory, with an unelected prime minister for 40 years, etc., etc. We know the story. And then the regime cracked down against those protesters. That narrative now is being changed quite deliberately by the regime to portray these protesters as Shia protesters who are guided by Iran. And this is done quite deliberately in order to mobilize the Bahrain Sunni population. And so what we've seen over the past year is the emergence of Sunni groups that are quite outspokenly anti-Shia. And so a sectarian dynamic and a sectarian narrative and dynamic have taken over. And this is, of course, very dangerous. And I have a story, an article coming out today or tomorrow, and you'll see some examples of how the sectarianism is expressing itself. I don't want to go into it now. The notion that Iran is involved in, I think I've said it on previous occasions, is without any evidence. You know, there's no sign of it. Moreover, and I'm not saying that the Iranians aren't, you know, laughing their heads off because, you know, they probably think they get great advantage of the current situation, but there is no indication that they are directly interfering. Now, the United States government, which hasn't, you know, doesn't have a great record on Bahrain, and I'm sure Tom will go into this in a bit, but it's right about one thing, which is that it has made very clear that it also thinks that there is, or strongly feels that there is no evidence that Iran is actively meddling in Bahrain. And in fact, the United States government has warned against the self-fulfilling prophecy that if you keep a significant part of the population marginalized, and you keep the system closed, you are going to drive them into the hands of the enemy, which is Iran. And so you may end up with what you're trying to prevent. Now, the United States, including the ambassador, have become target of an active media campaign in Bahrain for having suggested these things. The ambassador, Tom Krajewski, I was going to say Tom Malinowski, but I don't think Tom Malinowski is going to be ambassador in Bahrain anytime soon. But Tom Krajewski has been personally attacked for these things. Now, what is happening behind the scenes, and where does this narrative come from? There's a clear power struggle that has taken place over the past year in the Royal Palace, where the Crown Prince, who is coming to Washington next week, as Steve said, has been marginalized. And more importantly, where the Crown Prince's institutions, the ones that had his imprint and his personal role on boards and whatnot, and his own people appointed to head them, that these institutions now are in the process of being refocused, if not dismantled. And so his power base is being taken from underneath him. And what it does is, and you can talk about the Economic Development Board, you can talk about Mumtalikat, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, you can talk about Tamkeen, you can talk about the Labour Market Regulatory Authority. All these institutions, which were initiatives of the Crown Prince, have been taken away from him. And this is very important because these institutions, they have one theme, which was to reduce Bahrain's dependence on Saudi Arabia. And because the fact of the matter is that Bahrain is totally dependent on Saudi Arabia for a number of things. First of all, its income. Bahrain gets 50% of the income of oil from a Saudi offshore field. This is most of Bahrain's budget. It also gets Saudi crude that it can refine at the Bahraini refinery. So economically, Bahrain is heavily dependent on Saudi Arabia. Now, to remove these institutions is not only undercutting the Crown Prince and his attempt at reaching out to the opposition, it is also reinforcing this dependency on Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia still has troops on the ground in Bahrain. They're far from population centers. They're sitting somewhere actually near the Formula One race circuit, but they don't come out of their barracks. So, but, you know, military force is fungible, just like money is, and so you can have all these people there and you free up your own forces to do the hard work of imposing security. Plus, it's like a security blanket. It's a psychological thing that as long as these troops are there, the regime feels it is protected and safe. There are other elements of the Saudi presence, and one is a little bit perverse, I would say. It's the Saudi weekenders. Socially, also Bahrain, in terms of its tourism, is also heavily dependent on the presence of Saudi families, and especially men, who come throughout the week, but also especially on weekends. Don't want to go into too much detail there either, but let's say on the bright side, Saudi women have a chance to drive. While the men are doing other things. Now, so the problem is now, or where this is headed, is that the regime, having pushed itself into that corner, is now taking it a step further with the help of its Saudi sponsors, and they're talking about a new project called the GCC Union, the Gulf Cooperation Council Union or Federation, where they want to turn the Gulf Cooperation Council from a security umbrella into an actual political federation. Now, if you look across the region, you'll see that there is very little appetite among GCC members for this. You know, Qatar has profiled itself as basically, you know, independent of Saudi Arabia and everything it possibly could. Oman is totally unhappy with the idea. Kuwait clearly has no interest in this. The UAE, you know, has its own oil and has no need to become part of a Saudi federation. Bahrain is desperate for it, at least the regime is desperate for it. And so what may happen from this project, if anything, because we don't know how realistic it is not a GCC federation, but a Bahraini-Saudi confederation. But what that would do in the end is turning, you know, the Bahraini regime's fear of extinction by incorporation into the Iranian Vilayat al-Faqih, you know, theocracy, turning that into, you know, political suicide by Saudi embrace. Because what would happen is that the Saudi regime will politically totally control the Bahraini regime. It already does so in many other ways. Now it would do so politically as well. Plus it would impose its Wahhabi social mores on the Bahrainis who as I already alluded to, have been quite cosmopolitan in their ways. So it's going to be a very major shift if that were to happen. Now, that's a very dark scenario, and but I think, you know, we have been hammering on this, everybody else has been hammering on this. There is still a way out, and there's only one way out, and that way is for the regime to seriously start with the implementation of the Bassiouni report's recommendations, release of political prisoners, very importantly, end of impunity, very importantly, and serious restructuring of the security forces, very importantly. And then to move to the next step, which is dialogue with the opposition and political reform. On the opposition side, I think it'd be very important for the opposition to very explicitly abjure the use of violence in demonstrations. Even if these groups themselves are not involved in the violence, it's very important that they come out clearly to state this, that this applies to all. And secondly, if there is to be another initiative and dialogue, and I would predict there will be one, that it join this dialogue and participated without any political preconditions. Thank you.
Thanks, Joost. We'll turn now to Khalil to hear sort of from his perspective and the opposition, Noah Fox's perspective.
Thank you. How much time do I have?
Like 12 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And I just lived the experience of being detained in Bahrain to Tom to talk about human rights. Just let me start with the question of why the Bahrainis, or huge number of Bahrainis, are in the street. Not because they are enjoying the summer or the sun in Bahrain and the humidity. There is a real cause that motivates a huge number of Bahrainis to get into the street despite the repression that's going to happen to them. And we have an experience that people are dying, people are injured and wounded severely, so it's not a joke. It's something serious that's going to happen to them. Why they are going to the street every now and then, and they are not retreating back? Because they have no choice. They either be in a sort of dignity or slavery. And I'm talking about this because one would think about a state that provides security, prosperity, development, and future for the generations. And a state that does not provide this security. This is what we are living in. We are living in a state that turns all the elements of its institutions and capabilities towards repressing the people when they are against the rulers. State should be inclusive of everyone. We don't have this. We have state ruled by one family and pro to this family. Anyone who wants to be in a position, he has to or she has to be very loyal, and despite what this loyalty is, genuine, credible, honest or not. So this what keep people momentum years after years. And if we're talking about Bahrain history, in 1920 till now, we have every 10 years we have people getting uprisings or demand or something like this. We had a chance during the independence to move into a real estate. Not real estate property, but real estate that we could consider. In 1973, we managed to get a contractual constitution. It's not perfect, it's not Westminster or American democracy, but it was something live that you can build on and develop this country to be very well recognized state like its nation. It's not happening. 18 months after this contractual constitution being there, the parliament was dissolved and we went into absolute ruling by the prime minister, who is in power for 50 years, not just 40 years. 10 years before the independence and now 40 years after the independence. And when we had a hope in 2001, when 98% of the Bahraini people, 98.4%, went and ratified a national charter, accepting and trusting the king that the days, the beautiful days that we have not lived, will be coming. And this 98% not like Mubarak 99% on presidential election or others. No. These were genuine and these were accurate, 98.4%. What happened a year after, a unilateral constitution just turned the space that the people could practice some sort of authority and development into the political system, turn it into the hands of the king. The executive branch fully controlled by the king. The legislative branch 50% controlled by the king, and gerrymandering through the electoral system makes this even worse. The judicial authority, it wasn't in 1973 in the hand of the rulers. It was independent, supposed to be growing and evolving, independent. But in 2002, all of these were not spelled out in the national charter to change it. And there is no will behind these changes that happen. And through peaceful means of boycotting the election in 2002, and with the advice of the international community and local advisors, get inside and work through within, and you will change the situation, the political situation. It's been worsened than ever. The cabinet was 66% almost with the people and 33% with the ruling family. Now it's more than 50% with the ruling family and 50% to the pro-government. The lands, corruption, economy, even civil society, very well controlled by the rulers. So we don't have a state of institutions independent that somebody, when they get some sort of offensive or crimes or whatever you want to call them, they have some other institutions to go and complain. If the police violated the human rights to a citizen, he cannot go and complain to the judicial authority. Just everyone, every element working against the people. This is just to understand why people are going to the street despite the risk of losing their lives. Getting through the understanding of the international community of what's happening in Bahrain. They were saying last year, when I was here in DC and other places, the Bahraini Independent Commission of Inquiry, which I will say BICI, will be the bridge to the political solution. This is not happening. Advices and even contribution from international community, with Yates, Timony, Daniel Lenthal, all Freshfield from French, they are all like good apples being put in a box of bad apples, just got contaminated, because the system does not allow good things to grow and to make the widest presence, because the whole state is not independent. All institutions are not independent. So the value out of BICI is zero on the ground. We have some paper saying that we have done this or that. As Josh said, no accountability. Not a single perpetrator, not from senior level, even from very lower level, have been brought to justice seriously. We have some numbers, but we don't know these people. Inspector General, that's supposed to be an independent body to, as a result of the implementation of BICI report, put within the Interior Ministry, and he is the father of prominent torturer. We talk about a mechanism that will bring perpetrators to justice. It's been put under General Prosecutor Office, which he hasn't raised any single case, even if you take these cases to him, against any member of the state. Not a senior level, even lower level. If you believe that 35 mosques And even if what Bassiouni recognized as only 5 mosques in Bahrain being demolished illegally, and he just mentioned this because he thought the legality and legitimacy of mosque is only because the king will issue an order to that. No, these were mosques 400 years aging, before even Al-Khalifa came to Bahrain. But even a single mosque that is demolished in Bahrain and there is nothing from the state to consider this is a serious case, this is something that to be questionable, let alone 80 persons have been killed, the daily repression, etc., etc. So there's a question to the international community: what do you want to see to move from wait and see what's happening in Bahrain in this match that's happening between the major population in Bahrain and the rulers? Do you want to see a situation like in Syria or and somewhere else in Libya and Yemen or whatever? Or there is a compelling opportunity to seriously support democratic transformation, knowing that the majority of the people that are followers of the main opposition are respecting this opposition in their strategic direction of reform to the regime and peaceful means? Or are we going to wait till the things just deteriorate to the level that is not controllable match, and we have the crew fighting with the sport people? I think there is an opportunity today. It's not like when it was 6 months ago, but I think it will be much compelling than 6 months later on. The things are dragging. Yes, we admit violence is getting and growing, and the cycle of violence is growing. The thing that worrying us, if this is serious, that swallowing of Bahrain into this unity is going to happen, this will change the whole thing upside down. So if we just wait as international community and not move to support things that to get Bahrain into stability, I think we will be just feeling sorry in few months to come. We were very open to any initiative of dialogue, but we want to have a serious dialogue. We want to have credible dialogue as being called by the international community. I've led the delegates to what's so-called national consensus dialogue. But I have talking now 8 minutes to you to just give you an overview. And I've been given 3 minutes in each session to talk about elected government or fully authorized parliament, etc. Imagine that. You will be engaged in a dialogue just to ask you to wait 5 hours to listen to people, and when the talking comes to you, they said, okay, you have 3 minutes to explain what do you want. Is this a dialogue? This is ridiculous. And these amendments that have been ratified today is just as a result of this ridiculous talking. It has not moved any authority outside of the hand of the king. When we talk about legislative authority, it's still in the hands, fully in the hands of the king. We talk about oversight to the government. It's not there. If we're talking about representation of the government for the people, it's not there. What they have put is that the program will be presented to the representative council. And if they disagree with this program for several times, I wouldn't get into the details, they have the threat of being dissolved, and they have to prepare their pocket for another 50 or 100,000 K to run another election. Who on earth will just gamble and take the risk of not accepting a government and go into election again and again? This is all what's been provided to Bahrain and labeled as this is fantastic, unprecedented move into our reform project. The way forward is still, there is an opening for credible dialogue with international community interest to have some sort of stability in Bahrain, long-term stability. This is not going to be there if there is not an inclusive system that includes all elements of Bahrain in power sharing with comfort to everyone that this system is not to be repressive, not to undermine anyone, not to spread discrimination, but to spread social justice, full citizenship, sharing of wealth, prosperity. I think I'm just raising a hope that the hope is still there, but we have to act fast because time is against us. Thank you.
Thanks, Khalil. Turn to Tom.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Well, I guess with that build-up, I should probably start with our little adventure. And also, it was interesting. It was our first night in Bahrain, and we heard that there was we'd gone out into one of the Shia villages, as they're called, really a suburb of the capital, and had heard that there was a demonstration in a nearby community, one of many happening in Bahrain at that time. We were there just before the Grand Prix, and so demonstrations were common before, but they became even more frequent in that week as everyone tried to seize the stage and show the world what was actually happening in Bahrain. So we heard about this and we thought, let's go check it out. And we arrived and there was a march. It was a peaceful march. This one, we saw no sign whatsoever that the participants in this march were preparing any act of violence, although other demonstrations have, as Joost mentioned, used violence. And what they do is they sort of wind through the streets of their community, the men in front and the women in back, chanting slogans you might imagine, opposing the Formula One race, calling for the release of Al-Khawaja and political prisoners. And the objective is to get to the main road, because that's where people get to be seen. They don't just want to be seen by their neighbors. They want to be seen by a wider public in the country. And it's at the main road that the riot police wait in what has become sort of a nightly ritual in these communities. So, we're approaching the main road. We're a couple of blocks away. People start getting nervous because we know what's going to happen. The women sort of disappear from the march. The young men, mostly teenagers, move forward. And we're kind of behind them. And then we don't really even see the riot police, but we see that these kids, basically, the moment they set eyes on the riot police on the road, they begin bolting. They begin running. And so suddenly there's this mass of people running at us in the night in the city, and you get caught up in this moment. You don't know what's on the other side, what's being fired at them, what's happening, and so we run as well. And once you start running, then you're part of it. And we're chased through the streets and eventually take shelter in a house, and the riot police broke into the house and gave me my first ever taste of pepper spray, which I do not recommend, although it's not necessarily a human rights violation. And then I say the magic words, which unfortunately most Bahrainis cannot say. I am an American, and that calmed the situation. We still heard some screams, some sound of people maybe being beaten a little bit, but things were kind of calmed by our presence, I think, on both sides, and then were taken away. And then had a very interesting experience talking to the police officers, which we probably would not have had if not for this adventure. And then 2 days later, we're meeting with the chief of national police for Bahrain and these foreign advisors and telling them about what it was like to be arrested by their finest. And we were able to tell them that we personally were not mistreated, but we also were able to tell them that in those 2 days, we'd interviewed a whole number of families and participants in other demonstrations, including one that took place in a neighboring community just 2 days before we were arrested. The kids were arrested at the end of a demo. They were taken to the same police station where we sat for a few hours. Everything was the same except for two things. One, there were no foreigners like us watching. and two, these kids were pushed off the top story of the house by the police onto a neighboring balcony, and then just viciously beaten gratuitously for about half an hour before being taken to the police station. And this, unfortunately, is the pattern that we've now since then reported on. As a result of the BICI, one positive initial effect of the BICI recommendations, you had a big reduction in abuse and torture within police stations and prisons, where last year all of these activists and leaders were taken and just tortured as part of their interrogation. But that abuse and brutality has been pushed out of these official places of detention onto the streets and back alleys of the communities where most of the opposition live and try to express themselves. And you see, as Joost mentioned, sort of widespread gratuitous use of tear gas preemptively. If the youngsters don't attack the police are going to attack the youngsters. And both sides try to sort of preempt each other now in this sort of escalating cycle. Sometimes the tear gas is shot right at people's heads, which is not the way it's supposed to be used. You have birdshot being fired at people. We saw many, many people wounded just in the week that we were there by birdshot, which can kill if it's shot at close range or shot into your eyes. And this was the source of, as you can imagine, a tremendous amount of anger. Now the BICI process, the report, I mean, I really do think it was a golden opportunity to end this kind of brutality. At the very least, it created this moment in which the government of Bahrain and the king had to acknowledge what it had done. Everyone we met with, because of the BICI report, had to acknowledge that opposition leaders were systematically tortured. And that's positive. They cannot deny it now because the king accepted that report. And there were a few small steps taken in the wake of the report to begin to improve things in Bahrain. But as Joost mentioned, and for all the reasons that he mentioned, momentum has really hit a brick wall in the last couple of months. And probably the most visible sign of that is the continued detention of a number of key opposition leaders, including the one you've all heard of, Al-Khawaja, who's on this hunger strike and has generated global attention, but also others who I think deserve just as much attention. One of them is actually a Sunni opposition leader, is sort of a secular Sunni, the head of, I think, what we might call a liberal opposition party, Ibrahim Sharif. And the government really doesn't want you to know that, because they want you to think that this is an entirely sectarian struggle. It's just Shia versus Sunni, rather than what it was at the start, a campaign for democratic reform in Bahrain. We had many conversations with senior government officials about these opposition leaders. We stressed that, number one, your own commission, the king's own commission, determined that their convictions were based on torture, that their verdicts did not actually mention a single crime. They were accused of things like, fomenting opposition to the royal family and holding meetings and things that were not crimes. And we talked about how to resolve that problem. And the one senior minister told us that the most likely outcome was what we saw a couple of days ago, in which the so-called court of cassation, the kind of court of last resort in Bahrain, decided not to release these men, but to send the case back to civilian court. One could see that in some small way as an indication of progress, but this senior minister, who I think was more on the reformist side, said, if that happens, it will be a killer for us, because the effect is to simply delay this process for presumably months and months more. And that's not good for anyone. So as a result of all this, and there's the other thing that struck us was there's nothing to look forward to right now in Bahrain. There was when the king appointed the commission, we could say, let's wait for the commission, and then when it came out with its report, let's wait for the implementation. Right now, there's no deadline for anything. There's no new process to wait for that might give people a reason to be patient. And so you have this process of radicalization on both sides, which is very, very dangerous. Joost mentioned, the radicalization on the Sunni side, which is something that, I think the hardliners in the royal family fomented and created, but it may be a monster that is hard for them now to control. You have these police officers who are sent out into the streets every night. Most of them are not Bahraini, which is an interesting part of the problem. They were recruited from Sunni communities in other countries in the region, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen. I met one young man who told me he'd been beaten after a demonstration by a police officer who kept on shouting, "Do you like Bashar al-Assad?" And the kid said, "No, I don't." He said, "Well, good, because he's killing my family." So you have this Sunni Syrian cop sent to Bahrain where he's sort of transposing his own grievances from Syria onto the Shia of Bahrain, just sort of pathetic and terrible and at the same time. And then, of course, imagine what this does to the young protesters on the streets. As we've seen in every country in the Middle East that's gone through this, when met with violence, demonstrators don't go home. They just get more desperate, they get more angry, more determined to come out and show their manhood and show their pride and their determination not to lose. And so you do get more violence. You do get kids who say, "I'm not going to get beaten up again. Next time I'm going to fight back." And they find a way to fight back. And, so now you see the use of these Molotov cocktails, and God knows what's going to be next. I think these things can spiral out of control much more quickly than we sometimes imagine. And, of course, moderate leaders then on both sides get marginalized. So what's needed? I mean, I think we all agree here that, as complicated as the situation is politically, whatever constraints may exist on the king's ability to make decisions, and we can talk about that complicated question, there really is only one solution that's viable, and it's a solution in which the king makes a bold gesture and makes it soon, beginning by releasing these opposition leaders, in part because one would hope, especially if they're given some stake in the political process at the same time in a dialogue, that they might be able to speak to the street and calm them down and give them some hope that a peaceful political process can produce something. Now, finally, U.S. policy. The narrative out there, among some critics is that, well, the U.S. just doesn't care about any of this, and it just supports the king of Bahrain and the monarchy and the Saudi role 100%. And you might imagine me to share a version of that view. I actually think things are somewhat more complex. The truth is the administration did make, I think, a very credible and strong effort last year to try to broker some sort of compromise between the two sides. It was U.S. pressure largely that I think led to the King's decision to appoint and accept the Bicky report, which I think still is a good thing. The U.S. pressed successfully for Al-Wafaq, the opposition party, not to be banned, which is a good thing and enables you to be here and to still have some hope of participation in a political process. And, from time to time, they've spoken out, not as often as I would like. But they haven't been silent. I think that would be a mistake. That said, we do have a policy towards Bahrain in which the Pentagon plays an inordinate role. And we all know the reasons for that. Bahrain hosts the Fifth Fleet. It's seen as a critical pillar of the U.S. strategy to contain Iran in the Persian Gulf. We met with the commander of the Fifth Fleet when we were there. I totally understand what his job is. His job is to patrol the Gulf, and he thinks he needs a base to do that and a good relationship with the government to maintain the base. He's concerned about the dependents living on that base and the ability of the U.S. military to have a welcoming place somewhere in the Middle East, and Bahrain has been a welcoming place. And there's this old geopolitical concern that the key strategic factor for the United States is countering Iran and maintaining the freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, right? That's what every sort of foreign policy professional is trained to believe is the predominant geopolitical concern in the region. And of course, it is an important one. But I would argue, and I've argued to them, there's also a new geopolitical concern that ought to be just as paramount, and that is that there is a very growing and I think dangerous for the United States perception that in this time of upheaval in the Middle East, the U.S. always reflexively lines up with its Sunni allies in the Gulf, whether they are for democracy, quote unquote, for whatever reasons, like in Syria, or against democracy, as they are in their own backyard, and that therefore U.S. policy is not principled. It's not what President Obama says it is. It is actually very cynical, and I think that perception plays into the hands of America's enemies, including Iran. It is absolutely in America's interest to try to counter it. And where is the place to disprove it? Obviously, Bahrain is the place. That's why this small place, one reason why this small place, I think, is so important. So what would I want the administration to do? One, I don't expect them to talk about Bahrain the way they talk about Syria. That's not the kind of consistency I'm looking for. But I do think it's important for them to be clear, consistent, and specific, which I think they can be within the context of their partnership with the Bahraini government, that the BICI recommendations have to be implemented in full stop, and rapidly, including the release of all these prisoners, not just sort of a humanitarian solution for one hunger striker. Second, they should condemn violence by the opposition, and I think they're right when they lecture al-Wafaq to condemn violence more forcefully. But they shouldn't maintain this sort of artificial balance in which every statement of criticism of one side should be matched by statement of criticism of the other side, because the facts are not actually balanced. You have, on one side, people who are responsible for acts of violence and who have not been held accountable, and on the other side, people whose sin is that they haven't adequately condemned acts of violence by some of their supporters, even though they do not commit it themselves. And I don't think that's an equivalency. Third, I think that U.S. officials should be, and I hope they are, at least privately telling the Bahraini government that time is short and that if they don't take a number of specific steps in the direction of the BICI reform quickly, there will be a series of escalating steps on the U.S. side to begin to treat Bahrain more, to put it more into the category of problem states in the region. Sponsoring a resolution at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, for example, which symbolically I think would be a very powerful signal to the Bahraini government. Denying U.S. visas to people who are implicated by the Bassiouni investigation in acts of torture and abuse if there's no accountability inside Bahrain. Fourth, I think there is a suspension of arms sales to Bahrain. I think that needs to be maintained. There is an argument to be made that that kind of sanction undermines reformers within the government, and there may be some risk of that, but I think the greater risk is sending a message to the Bahraini government, particularly the hardliners, that no matter what they do, the United States needs them more than they need us, and that they will not suffer any consequences. I think that's more dangerous in the long term. And then finally, I don't go so far as to say that the U.S. should withdraw its base, as some people do. I do think the U.S. presence, at least for now, gives the U.S. a degree of influence, which I want it to be using, both publicly and behind the scenes. But I do think it's time to say to the Bahrainis, at least privately, what I think is in any case true, and that is that the military presence is not going to be sustainable if the situation continues to spiral out of control. I think that happens to be true. There is a level of violence that no one will be able to tolerate. And so in a sense, the best way, if I were in the U.S. military, I would think that the best way to save this base, if that were my one and only concern, would be to indicate a willingness to consider its abandonment. That's maybe ironic, but something that I want them to consider. In sum, I think this is a very, very dangerous moment. I think there is a real risk of this spiraling very quickly out of control. I don't think Bahrain is beyond the point of no return, though. I do think there's still room for compromise and dialogue. It's a country in which the protagonists know each other. I don't think the relationships have been completely broken as they have been, say, in Syria. So time is short, but it isn't too late. Thank you.
Thanks very much. At this point, I'll go ahead and open up. We have about half an hour. I'm opening up the floor to questions. If you could please just state your name and affiliation before you ask your question. We'll start right there in the back. And please wait, we have a couple of mics that'll come around.
My name is Mohammed Al-Adib. I'm an international development consultant. And the question is, the recommendations made about Bahrain were engagements directly with the country. Mr. Hilterman mentioned how the economy is dependent on Saudi. And I know at the beginning, when the opposition was very strong, the king was showing a hand, reaching out to the opposition. And as soon as that happened, the Saudi military moved in and really repressed the situation. Could you comment more on how we should engage Bahrain, but at the same time engage Saudi, and how we should do that?
When you say we, you mean the United States government? Okay. Because I'm not involved in that. Right. I think Tom has already, mentioned the dilemma about the Fifth Fleet, and the fact that the United States has such important military assets in Bahrain both gives it influence and limits it at the same time. It's paradoxical, but without those assets, they wouldn't really have a lot to talk about with the Bahraini government. With those assets, they can, but it gives the regime the idea that the United States needs Bahrain more than the other way around. Then you have Saudi Arabia next door, and Saudi Arabia has huge interests in Bahrain. Of course, it sees it as its Achilles heel in the Gulf, the entry point for Iran because of Bahrain's Shia population, which is not trusted. And Saudi Arabia, just across the causeway, has its own Shia population in the area of its oil fields. So it's a very sensitive situation. After the fall of Hosni Mubarak and the U.S. position on this, which actually at the time wasn't clear at all, but the perception on the part of Saudi Arabia that the United States shepherded this process of transition in Egypt, the Saudis were very alarmed. And the United States recognized that and did much to appease the Saudis. The crackdown in Bahrain, the Bahraini crackdown on protesters and the Saudi military intervention happened at that time. And the United States tried to forestall it, and there was an attempt to broker an agreement between the various sides, and it broke down. My question still is, did the Saudis intervene, or did the Bahraini regime invite the Saudis to intervene, or wherever the pressure came from? I don't know the answer to that either. But was it because the street protests were getting out of hand and the regime was seriously frightened that it would be overthrown? Or was it because they feared that there would be an agreement between the regime and the opposition? And there would be actually dialogue leading to political reform, which in the long term, from the regime's point of view, would also lead to the overthrow of the regime, because it thinks that if you start opening the political process, the end result will be that the opposition will take over first the parliament, and before you know it, the prime minister is going to be elected and not appointed, and so the regime loses its control step by step, and in the end, Iran is right there. So I'm not saying this is realistic, but these are the fears, of course, or the manipulated fears anyway. So for the United States to step into this is extremely, very difficult. And so their approach has been to emphasize with the Bahraini regime that the only way forward is to open up the system gradually, and to talk with the non-violent opposition, the moderate opposition, the licensed opposition groups, such as Al-Wifaq, which is the largest of them. And until now, the United States also meets openly with Al-Wifaq, which makes the regime, drives them crazy. But I think it gives Al-Wifaq real space to operate, and as Tom said, it allowed Khalil, fortunately, to come here and to speak out. So. But it's playing a very difficult game, and so it has spoken out in some human rights cases, some high-profile cases, where it could clearly make a difference. And it has warned the regime, as I mentioned earlier, that it could be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The regime could be, if it in fact keeps the opposition locked out of politics. But beyond that, it's going to be very difficult, because not only does the United States have assets in Bahrain, it also doesn't want to further panic the Saudis, as long as the United States remains so heavily dependent on the free flow of oil from Saudi Arabia. So these are the constraints. I'm sure others can weigh in with more nuanced analysis.
I'd like to ask Khalil to give his assessment of U.S. policy. He's been meeting with, I think, policymakers this week in Washington. What are you telling them in terms of your view, the Fox view, of the steps they have taken, and what, in your view, are the steps they should be taking going ahead?
Thanks, Joe. Let's be very realistic on expectation from United States when we talk about support to the people in this region and support to the elite regimes that they have built a strategic interest and evolved their even strength to be in this position. The key thing that we're trying to emphasize on is that don't just wait and see what's happening. You have to contribute positively in the scene that's happening in Bahrain for the interest of everyone. I just comment on the question by Muhammad, is that the interest of the Saudis is to see stability in Bahrain, not to continue the stability of Bahrain. And if the United States convince the Saudis, I think even the position of the Saudis is different now from 1 year ago. On this aspect is that how to contribute. One of the key things to contribute is that I think my colleagues in the panel was saying the serious implementation of Beeke report. Serious implementation of Beeke report will solve two key things. The inclusive security. Yes, this is a long-term strategy. And the independence of judicial. We have left with 3 main pillars that moves you into an inclusive political system, which is the government, the legislative, and the baseline for this, which is the democratic process. If we be clear and specific, like Tom said, what do we want from Bahrain to move into? And to convince Saudis that these are in the interest of your regional interest. The Bahrainis in 1971, when the commission from UN came to Bahrain, they had the chance to say, we don't want Al-Khalifa. Al-Khalifa, before 1971, they were not very nice to the Bahrainis, so that everyone will think, no, they've chosen Al-Khalifa to be the rulers because they were nice in the past almost 200 years to the Bahrainis, so that the people did not expect they will change their attitudes toward the people. No, Bahraini people realistically said, okay, as long as we are moving into some sort of inclusive system, we will accept Al-Khalifa to be the rulers in a democratic system. But this is not happening. So the trust is not coming from the people of Bahrain to Al-Khalifa, to include them or not to include them. Now the big question about trust, whether the Bahraini people should continue to trust the rulers if they continue to leave them in power and not to allow them to be part of this power to spread social justice and citizenships and other things. So I think being specific on the demands that we want to see roadmap to have this country for our interest, for our neighbors' interest. And talking about Iran intervention and Iran exploitation and Iran interest, always the Bahrainis did not show that these interests exist to think about worries that might happen in the future. And I just was explaining today, when you draft a political system, it's not like water that you move it from one glass to another glass and say, this is a democratic system, we're drafting it in a constitution, but once these Shia get into politics, they will change it and put it and make it wilayat al-faqih political system. It cannot work like this. You have very well-defined politics. That process cannot just be changing from one platform to another platform, but just because some people are there. At the end, the Shia are citizens in Bahrain. What if the majority in Bahraini population were Buddhist, were Christian, were Jewish? Are we going to accept that they should be repressed and they should be out of the political process just because of their religious identity or ethnic identity? I think we need to just remove our glasses of the sectarian view to the Bahraini people, to the human view and citizenship view to the Bahraini people, and with helping them, it will let them look at you as you are the protector of their interests rather than you are part of their oppression. When time comes, like Mubarak should leave, Mubarak should negotiate, Mubarak should, I don't know. This was jeopardizing the United States image within the Egyptians. So the Egyptians did not see United States firm about their demand, their aspiration to have, and this is happening to several countries within the Arab Spring. We know the complication in Syria. It's not because just of the Syrians. So United States should not show to the population in GCC that they are only there for their interest, and when it comes that the people won the battle, okay, we will catch up and we will be with you in your interest as well. Now, I think there are strategic interests that lies with the people in this region, and Bahrain is a good model to have very successful story on peaceful transformation that inclusive of everyone, including the ruling family.
Thanks, Khalil. We're covering or live tweeting this event on Twitter, and we have a couple of questions that have come in via Twitter that I'll raise now. The first is, the question is, would the U.S. give more support to real democratic reform in Bahrain if the opposition wasn't led primarily by Islamist party? If the, is some element of the U.S. reaction and role in Bahrain related to what we often sort of hear here in Washington about sort of a fear and uneasiness with what's perceived as the role of Islamist actors in the region. The second question, Tom sort of addressed at the very end, and maybe the question came in before that, but I'll see if either of the other of you have thoughts on this, which is what next steps would you recommend to international actors if the Bahraini government continues to ignore international calls for serious reforms and credible dialogue? Tom already mentioned, the possibility of sponsoring a resolution at the Human Rights Council denying visas to those guilty under BCI Commission and continuing arms suspension. I don't know if Yost or Khalil, if you have other thoughts on those.
If I start with the Islamists, is that you look into the people by their clothes and identity, or you look at the people with their thinking and their actions. If you look into the materials of these Islamists leading, including Ayatollah Isa Qasim, and if you see how open and how he's having a strategic vision about democratic state and not saying religious or theocratic state, and even Sheikh Ali Salman, who is leading, I think, Justin, Tom, you've met with him. So if you look at the individuals from this perspective, is that are you looking at the clothes or are you looking at the qualities and the thinking, the mindset of these people? This is one aspect. I've challenged anyone that could bring some speeches out of Sheikh Ali Salman or even Ayatollah Isa Qasim that he was talking that we want a religious state, or we want to move into this, or even sectarian business. The other aspect is that I think the Americans is just talking to the Muslim Brotherhoods, and they're supporting the Muslim Brotherhoods, and they are talking even with the Taliban. So I don't know if Shia is exceptional, that Islamist within the Shia is something so special. So they shouldn't call for democracy. They shouldn't call for for their rights, they always should be suspected by their regime, their neighborhoods, and the Americans and the Western community. I don't know how to deal with this. If somebody is suggesting that we should change our identity, then let's discuss it off the record. But if you think that we are humans and we deserve universal rights, and all this 10 years of microscopic and macroscopic monitoring on Al-Wifaq, I know this. I know that they monitor even my dress, and some in WikiLeaks said that he is very well, sorry to say this, but very well dressed in modern Western dress. And they get into details of how we dress and how we talk. And this is just a few things about what happened from WikiLeaks. So they know, and they put us under monitor for 10 years from our official establishment till now. So they know if we have religious ambitions, if they know if we have political ties with Iran, etc., etc. So I think not this is what's causing the Americans not moving ahead. What's causing the American is that they think the strategic interest still with the Saudis. It's not time to revise it. I'm saying no, it's the time to revise it, and for your interest and everyone's interest.
Jos, do you have anything?
Nothing to add.
Okay. A question here. We have quite a few hands now. I'll take a couple of questions together. There's one there and then just behind her.
Hi, I'm Kristen Diwan from American University. I'm wondering, a question is mostly for Khalil Marzouk. Can you speak a little bit about the meeting that you did hold with the Royal Court, and also just your assessment of kind of the power centers in Bahrain right now? How much space do they have from the Saudis? I mean, and are there divisions amongst opinions towards this upcoming confederation that's being discussed? And Joost, if you want to add to that maybe as well. Thanks.
Thanks. We'll take one or two more questions.
Hi, I'm a Bahraini student here in DC. And my question was to Khalil. To what degree was Al-Wifaq opening its doors to Sunni participation historically? And why is it that Al-Wifaq has shaped up in the way that it has, in a way that's kind of very Shia in rhetoric or in just its population? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one more question.
Sanjeev Berry with Amnesty International. Thank you all for your comments. Questions for Khalil. You had sort of made a comment with regards to revising the U.S. revising its perception of the need to prioritize its strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia into something else. And if you could speak some more with regards to what you had in mind as an alternative prioritization.
Thanks. Most of those are directed at Khalil, so we'll start with Khalil and then Joost and Tom if you want to add something.
I think the communication that started a few months ago, before the anniversary of the revolution or whatever you want to call it, 14 February, was just to signal to the international community that we are in communication. They know that Wifaq will always say we are positive to dialogue. And since there is some sort of communications going on, then we will say, no, we are positive and we are going ahead. So that the situation was cooling down from the international pressure. And I've met with several diplomats and even from foreign ministries in Europe and United States, and we passed the same message. 14 February, the anniversary passed because they said, no, we want to wait and see what's going on. We have not called for a major rally to the Pearl Roundabout, precious thing to most of the Bahraini people. So just to save lives, because we know this could turn into something very disastrous. We waited for that. They said, okay, let's get into 20th March, when we will hand over or submit the National Commission following the implementation of BK. And we waited for that. The small communication that is, yes, we will go into Shura Council will be there, but the third reading will be with the representative council, a referendum will take place or not to take place. And 2 weeks later on, they said, no, we cannot accept the Shura not to be in power, because they want to maintain the legislative authority within their hand. Because they fear also the referendum that the Bahrainis will not accept something that is not acceptable. They don't want to get into no more 98.4 without serious reform. So they are skeptical about this. So I said, if you don't want to go into referendum, you don't want to lose the legislative authority, why should we get into dialogue? Then they said, okay, a positive gesture came. Just wait for Formula One, and now we will wait for Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan, and then Hajj, and we will see. This is the sort of theme that one who doesn't want to compromise is leading this. That's why I've said international support should push into credible dialogue. The Saudis, yes, they thought initially. Everyone was stunned with the Arab Spring, even the Americans, maybe. Some people say this, they are part of this, they have incited it, but let me put this aside. What to do with what's happening? Bahrain is the third country to witness such thing. So the best thing is to engage in military presence, just to send signals to everyone that we are here. Don't think that Bahraini regime is alone. So with this complication, it's strip out more authority from the Bahraini royal family in the local domestics to move it with the Saudis. And this complication still now that's happening. And this creates even rivalry between the royal family members, between those who want this to continue and those who doesn't want this to continue, because it's an advantage of the hardliners that they want to keep this pressure from the Saudis continue and the support continue. Those moderates who doesn't want this to continue because they want to move, they want to find a solution, they want to find way out for this. So this is how the United States could convince the Saudis that this is not of your interest to maintain this presence in Bahrain, let alone if they go ahead with this crazy idea of swallowing Bahrain into the what's so-called bilateral unity between Bahrain and Saudi. This will create really a upside-down situation in Bahrain and in the region. The strategic interest and strategic policy that we don't want to have external regional exploitation, this cannot be maintained later on with this move. Why Bahrain? Why Wifaq is only Shia? Not because Wifaq does not want Shia Sunnis, because this is the sort of the strategic direction of the rulers to split Sunnis and Shia apart, not to have them in unity. And let me give you an example: is that during the martial law, they threatened the democratic societies who were in collision with us, not part of Al-Wifaq, but they have put severe pressures on them not to be maintaining this coalition because they don't want to see Sunnis and Shia. Why Ibrahim Sharif is different? Because Ibrahim Sharif, a Sunni, secular, he was very outspeaking out of the Sunnis, and they have to teach the Sunnis a lesson that if you speak against the rulers, you will be like Ibrahim Sharif in jail. We will not just consider you that you are a Sunni. We are welcoming the Sunnis to be in Al-Wifaq. We are open. We cannot push the Sunnis to just join Al-Wifaq. It's the system that separates the Sunnis and the Shia from each other, not the Wifaq. And if you just review all our public speeches and the rallies for the past 14 months, you will see the only party that call for unity and sending good signals to the other. You go to the other rallies, you will see different messages. You will see hatred messages. You will see polarization messages that create more frustration or our brothers in the country. I think there is a question about priority. Saudis. One of the key things that if the Saudis misled that the Shia will only act against their interest in Bahrain, and they continue to consider this is the right thing. This is a Bible. This is Quran. This cannot change. This is wrong. How to convince the Saudis that these citizens in Bahrain, yes, they are Shia, but at the end they are citizens. They are working in the interest of the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council. They are Arabs. Mainly the Bahrainis are Arab. There are some people origin from Iran, but this is true for the Sunnis as the Shias as well. And maybe if those who are Iranian or Persian origin, the Sunni side maybe even more than the Shiite side. It's always the skeptical about the Shia and not in the right context. It's always that the Shia is somebody who is always revolutionary. It's not in the context. Shia, when they find that there is a sort of social justice, inclusiveness, etc., they are not gonna make some sort of revolutions. Look at the Shia in the Kuwaiti state. You will see the Shias are pro-government rather than, because they felt the state protecting them, because they are minorities. The state in Kuwait allowed the business to go along without merging between or marrying between the politics and business. That's why you will see some businessmen very wealthy and influential in Kuwait. So I know it's difficult. It's not just something that we talk here and the Saudis will believe us. But I think the priorities should be in that this element in Bahrain is not against you. And we've sent signals to them. You will continue to be the backbone and the main pillar or pivotal thing to GCC. On the other front is that more repression, more of confiscation of the right of the Shia. It's just giving exploitation opportunities to Iranians. Either you want to limit or close down these exploitation, or just you want to have them open. If you have them open, they will be vulnerable to success. If you close them, and part of the closure will be to have some sort of inclusive system in Bahrain. Now, let me think about the Eastern Province in Saudi. Will this transformation into democracy will be helpful? I think the United States and Saudis and all GCC should work on something that is peaceful transformation to democracy in whole region. Just leaving the things till it explode, it won't help. If we have to have some sort of priority and genuine advice to all rulers in this region, we will advise them to move into democracy for their interest, rather than just leaving it to the moment of explosion and nobody knows what's going to happen. In Saudi, it's too complicated. It's not like Bahrain. Weapons are spread there, and the tribal nature and the competition between the princes. I don't want to get into Saudi politics so that I irritate our big brothers. But seriously, a genuine advice to move into some sort of reform will be on priority one to enhance the strategic interest that will be stable, not just vulnerable to surprises.
Okay, we're just about out of time. We'll take one or two last questions and then give each of the three speakers an opportunity to respond. So, here.
I'm a research assistant at the Atlantic Council. My question is actually to Khalil Marzouk.
He detained, so you have to question him.
It's more specifically political. I have two questions. The first question is, it looks from your rallies and your statements, Al-Wifaq, I mean, that Al-Wifaq demands right now the resignation of the government and an elected prime minister, if I understand it correctly. If hypothetically the government offers you some sort of a dialogue in which that condition will not be achieved, but you will get fairer districts, you'll get the parliament you've been looking for, and etc. Do you think Al-Wifaq will be willing to consider that? And my second question is, the Biki report talked in a lot of detail about Al-Wifaq negotiations with the Crown Prince. Of course, we don't know what has happened since then, but has Al-Wifaq engaged in any of these talks with the Crown Prince after the crackdown and until today? Thank you.
We'll take one last question here.
Thank you. My question is on the sectarian picturing of the Bahrain situation. And here, if you look at the Sunni public opinion in Bahrain, or even I would say even the Arab public opinion, the government, as you said, has succeeded in showing that it's more a sectarian than a democratic battle. My question to you is: how would the Bahrain opposition, what type of actions can the Bahrain opposition take in order to reverse this view? And here, beyond just the talk that you are making here and there, what practical actions, resolutions do you want to put on the table in order to say that we want to work with the Sunnis in order to work for a democratic Bahrain?
Okay, and we just have a couple minutes left, so Khalil, if you could just pretty briefly respond to each of these questions, and then Tom and Yost have a final word.
Oh, either we solve the Bahraini problem for God's sake, or just leave it open now I wouldn't say 10 years. So if we don't go for an inclusive system that encompasses all the real representation of people within this system, within the main elements or institutions, the executive branch, legislative, etc., it won't work. We're just running away with the problem for another 2 years or 5 years when things happening. What kept Wifaq participating in 2006 and 2010 is that the environment is not pro changes, so it's nobody interested. But with Arab Spring, this has changed the dynamics totally. So if something happened, if we agree on something that is not really rigorous and rigid to have a stable political system, anything happen in the region will evolve another uprising or revolution. So this will not stand. That's why we will negotiate on the table, and we clarify this. And we had clarified this with the Crown Prince. I've communicated with the Crown Prince 5 times, 3 personally, alone. No one with us. I'm just trying to reach something that is on the strategic horizon that's not breakable. No, Crown Prince was isolated. He was suspended from his initiative the whole of the last year. He is moving around. Let me be diplomatic in this. And we are open to all talks with everyone, including the Royal Court Minister, which I think everyone feels that he is the most on the top list of the hardliners. On the sectarian reverse, we tried to reach out to the Sunnis, but the problem is not lying with the Sunnis. If the most prominent people within the Sunni community leadership says, yes, we want to go with democracy, they don't have it. That's why it's not going to work. We have not issued a single statement that we're saying the police are Sunnis, the army are Sunnis, the bureaucracy is Sunnis, and these violations happening from the Sunnis to the Shia. We just kept ourselves isolated from this sectarian game. We tried with intellectuals like Dr. Ali Fakhro and others to try to launch some initiatives on the principles of Crown Prince. We are open to that. But the environment is so polarized and so fearful that the leadership from the Sunni side cannot just rise up and face it and say, no, we want to take our country into safe coast. It's the problem is that the repression is continuing. That makes not just the Shia fear to get into continuation. One of it is to have the Sunnis fear to join this struggle for reform. And they have a big campaign of PR trying to distort what's happening in Bahrain as a Shia only. It's a sectarian nature, etc., etc. We went to Egypt, and before we reached there, because they know, they sent delegates to prevent us from reaching to different parties. So, and this repeated in Tunisia, etc. So this is a real battle. It's either be in full power or lose the power. They don't want to share the power. So they think it's that once the moment they lose some power to the people, it will gradually go away. They control lands in Bahrain, 80% of the lands. Not just to talk about business and oil. We don't know how much oil is coming into Bahrain. Seriously, how do they sell this oil? Details. When we have investigated the public properties, we want to see some documents. The registrar is fully controlled by ruling family. So they can change the documents by, this is granted for school. They change it to Mr. Khalifa. And and if you go and ask, I want to see the official document, they will tell you, this is an official document. This is a state official document. So how to control things, how to combat corruption. They feel if they lose power and they have empowered parliament and bureaucracy shared with others, no, the Sunnis and the Shia will be bringing them to accountability. Why are you stealing our lands? But now we cannot do it.
Okay. Any closing words, Tom, Joost?
Well, one thing I certainly learned in my few days in Bahrain is that it's a very complicated place, and we can talk for hours about your question about sectarianism and who said what to whom in the dialogue, and and particularly questions I think about the relationship between the moderates and hardliners in the government. How much authority does the king and the crown prince really have to do the things that we would want them to do? If they released all the prisoners and started a dialogue with al-Wafaq, would there be a coup? Would somebody stop them? Would the Saudis move in? Would the Saudis stop all the progress? Or in fact, do the Saudis now want the Bahraini government to solve all of this because of the instability? I had multiple conversations in Bahrain in which people suggested, all different permutations, right, of answers to those questions. And it's fascinating. But I think for those of us on the outside, it's also important to remember that virtually every reasonable person in Bahrain agrees on what the solution is. They agree on that there really is only one viable solution, and that is that the royal family has to be willing to accept a political process that involves compromise on both sides that would result in its preservation, but in a system that gives the majority greater representation and democratic rights. That's the only viable solution. So if that's the only viable solution, the only viable option for us is to press for it, right? And if it turns out that the king doesn't have the authority to do that, or that the Saudis will stop it, well, then we're out of luck anyway, right? And the situation is going to continue to spiral out of control, and it will be a catastrophe. So, it's an interesting discussion, but at the end of the day, if we're concerned about U.S. policy and what the international community should do, I think the answers are fairly simple. We should push for what is the only viable solution to the crisis in Bahrain and use every element of influence that we have to promote it.
Very little to add to that. I mean, we have a conflict in Bahrain. It may not be an armed conflict, alhamdulillah. And it certainly doesn't rise to the level of conflict that we see in Syria, but it's a conflict. And with any conflict, the basic problem is one of lack of trust and real and imagined fears. The word fear has been raised on several occasions, and we have to recognize that. So how do you bridge that? How do you get sides back together and overcome this fear and this very profound lack of trust? There is no easy solution to that, but there is such a thing as confidence-building measures or mechanisms or whatever, steps. And so you need to rebuild confidence. That's the idea. Now, there are still forces in Bahrain, and I think Khalil's party is one of them, but there are also within the regime and the government still factions, groups that want to move toward a solution. They face serious odds, and there are extremists on both sides, but the real problem is with the regime, of course, because they hold all of the power. What is needed, I think, is first of all, some kind of clear symbolic statement, almost a psychological break, because the question is, do the things have to get worse before people are forced into a more constructive approach? But what could preempt that is some kind of symbolic move. For example, a decision totally consistent with the recommendations of the Bassiouni report to release the political prisoners. I mean, that, I think you've mentioned it, Tom and Khalil, that would send a clear message, plus it could help calm the street. But then you need to think of small steps, and so you need to move into dialogue. Now, Khalil has said rightly that you shouldn't just engage in any kind of dialogue. It could be empty dialogue. What's the point? It could be damaging, in fact. But you want serious dialogue. How can you ensure that any dialogue you enter into is going to be serious? You can't. But you could have some prior agreement, and I know because there have been attempts at dialogue and some exchange of documents and this and that, and people are talking. There has to be some kind of prior agreement that once you enter into dialogue, there will be some initial steps that both sides can agree to that would start creating momentum. And then you have to take it from there. Of course, then the regional situation will have a bearing. Let's say there's a sudden change in Saudi Arabia. The leadership there is aging, to say the least, and there could be significant changes there. We cannot control for all factors, but the solution has to come from within, and I think the willingness is there on the part of some significant groups, and they need to move in that direction. I think the fact that the Crown Prince is still coming here, still being received, means that he has not been totally marginalized, even though he clearly has lost a lot of control. The fact that El Wifaq can still call a large demonstration, as you did on March 7th or 8th? What was it? 9th, I'm sorry, I would get there sooner or later, without any violence is very significant, because it means they still have a significant command over the protesters and how they conduct themselves in the streets. So there are these signs of hope. We should not give up hope on this situation. But we need to certainly call on our leaders, wherever they may be, to encourage this process and not to sort of forget about Bahrain because, it's Arab Spring, but it's a special case because they're Shia, or something ridiculous like that. But in fact work toward this, because it is in the end certainly in the Western interest that stability be preserved in the Gulf, and stability cannot be preserved through naked violence. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much to all our speakers, and thanks to all of you for coming. We look forward to seeing you at our next event.